Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name's Emily, and I'll be co-hosting along with Giulia and Nicolle tonight. And we have an awesome panel discussion on hybrid NLU and LLM experiences. So I think what we'll do first is just go give a round of introductions for everyone. And then I'll do a quick breakdown on the topic just in case, just to kind of clarify what we mean by NLU and LLM. And then we'll get into the questions. So I think let's start with Nicolle.
I'm muting. Hi, I'm Nicolle Merrill. I am a principal conversation designer at a large fintech company. And then I run Boring AI, which is a AI literacy company as well. Awesome. And then we popcorning over to people.
Let's do it.
All right, let's go, Dennis.
All right, name is Dennis. I lead the machine learning team at VoiceFlow, which is a conversational AI company. I've been mainly working hands-on in the ML AI space since 2021, and prior to that, I was a cloud architect at a large bank. So, over to. I'm scared to pronounce everybody's name. Okay, I'll go over to Michael.
Hi, I'm Michal, and I am a co-founder of a startup in Poland that is producing conversational experiences since 2018. We've been working with AI and transformers as soon as they appeared, so the last couple of years. And now we've sort of our focus shifted towards generative AI, obviously. But yes, our main focus is conversational experiences. And let's go to Sean.
Hi, I'm Siân. I'm a freelancer designer and strategist who works on multimodal and conversational products. So I started off kind of when Alexa was first released. I'm glad that didn't set off anyone's Alexa. And now the past kind of year, I've spent a lot of time working on hybrid experiences that use large language models and knowledge bases. Over to Giulia.
Yeah, I'm Giulia, and I'm a conversation designer, but most importantly, for the purpose of this, I've been co-moderating with Emily for a lot of these panels, so I'm really excited for this one, which seems like a really current topic. So thank you also to Nicolle for bringing it up and for co-moderating with us today. And I think it's over to Caio.
Hi, everybody. My name is Caio Calado. I'm speaking to you from São Paulo, Brazil. I am a conversation designer working as an educational program manager in a Brazilian company that is expanding in Latin America and also Europe. The company has been doing bots since 2000s, goes way back. And we are also thrilled to be part of this journey. I think everybody's just going with the flow. And it's so exciting, so many changes, so many new things to learn. And I'm really excited to be here with you and learn with everybody. I guess it's back to Emily.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a content and conversation designer. And yeah, I've been hosting these with Giulia, and we're so excited to have you all and to be doing this topic. And we do have one more person joining. That's Pete from VoiceFlow as well. So he will hopefully join in a couple of minutes. But before we get started, for people that may not be as familiar with NLU and LLM and hybrid experiences, I wanted to quickly kind of define and break down what we're going to cover. So when we talk about NLU or natural language understanding, we're talking about a focus on understanding what a person's trying to say and what they want to accomplish, otherwise known as their intent. So within a traditional chatbot experience, we have to anticipate all of the possible intents and everything a person could possibly say within that intent. And then we have to think through the logic of the conversation, design conversational flows, and manually write responses for every single variation of the conversation. So with large language models, or LLMs, we don't have to do that as much. An example of a large language model is like ChatGPT, GPT-4, Bard, Llama. So large language models are trained on a large amount of data that helps the model understand and respond to what a person says based on the data. So this helps cover a broader area of conversation, but it leaves you with less control over how the bot is responding to the user. So there are definitely pros and cons to each approach on its own, but you can get the best of both worlds when you combine the two approaches, which is what we're going to talk about today. So does anyone else have anything to add to that? I hope that was kind of clear. Okay, cool. So I'll pass it over to Nicolle.
Fabulous. I think in all these conversations that I've been having just through the last month, there's one thing that really comes through, and that's experimentation, right? Followed quickly by learning, right? I think that sums up so much of this experience. And so the first question I have really is kind of anchored in that. For those of us who work on bots that are NLU, right? We work on assistants that are NLU based, and we've been, kind of either tasked with or we're curious about integrating, an LLM, right? So how do you identify which parts of your bot should be give generative responses in a hybrid model? So in this case, we'd be using the model to actually, or excuse me, the LLM to actually provide the response rather than writing it out ourselves. But the backend intent detection is still NLU based. And that is an open question.
I'm happy to jump in there. So I personally look at value add. Obviously, everyone jumps to personalization, but we all know that you can create varied responses within a NLU output. So really, it's looking at, does this really add value to the user beyond kind of acknowledgement? And then also looking at risk. Risk is a huge thing. Anywhere where there's high risk, I would obviously avoid using large language model. And by that, I don't necessarily just mean hallucinations. It could be things like, I actually worked on one with Michal recently, where one of the risks was identified as the potentially disclosing the origin of Santa to children. So it could be anything really risk-based beyond hallucinations as well.
Yeah, I think it's large language models are pretty powerful as well from the prototyping perspective. So what we found with just a lot of people who've been trying to build bots themselves, what they want to do is get something working as quickly as possible. And kind of in a traditional context, you'd have to define your NLU model. You'd have to go ahead and sort of put in your responses, and that took a lot of work. And it wasn't as much of an aha moment for many people. So it's kind of interesting looking from a time to value perspective and saying, okay, I can have an LLM that can respond either based on a flow that originates from an NLU or just assuming that there's an open path to entry, and you can have a conversation. I think that's kind of what got people thinking how magical ChatGPT was, because you didn't have this sort of restrictive space. Now, I think going back to the point, when you go down a certain flow, you have different options. You can have levels of personalization. You can have static responses. You can have LLM responses. There's a lot of flexibility there. So what we've seen a lot of people do is they built out an LLM bot and then actually figure out what are the most common responses, where are there mistakes through testing and trial. And eventually they might separate those out into top 10 intents that should have defined flows, that should have defined paths, defined integrations, defined responses. So I think these things can coexist in the same assistant, but also can coexist throughout the development journey of starting off with a prototype and then making your way into something that's production ready, or a V2 or a V3, wherever you end up.
Can I add? Can I say something? So I'm going to go in a different perspective, but I'm going to try to add to Sean and Dennis' vision. Most of the times that I see conversation designers talking about LLMs in this context, usually we refer to adding to the conversations as a way to deal with many questions from the users. But another way to see the use of LLMs is on the top of the conversation, meaning that when the user is having a conversation with a bot on WhatsApp, on a web chat, whatever, they are having a conversation with an agent. Yes, it can use LLM, but it can be another human on the other side. It can be an automation, it can be many things. We can use LLMs to help the human agents to have a better conversation with the user. How? We can use LLMs to create a better handover, human to agent, agent to human. We can have LLMs to try to define and be precise in the information that is going to provide to the final user. We can even have a LLM to try to understand what is the conversation about, making it some reason, and even create a score that is going to help the, I'm sorry for my English, sometimes I forget the word, but help the customer agent team to be better at the customer service. So LLM, it can be used in many different ways. One way for sure is to answer the most frequent questions, but I would invite everybody to be, not here, but whoever is listening, there is many other practical uses about that. And the challenge is how Sean said, is to find the value to the user. How we can make that works not from the technology perspective, but from the user perspective, and build on top of that, how this is going to add to the user experience. If we think for a moment, having a human support agent person, right? Human agent person answering correctly all the questions that the user have, or even having an LLM to prompt the answer that this person can give to the final user with the correct info and most up-to-date info, that's a great experience. So that's it's great business, but it's a different use case that we see. Actually, it's different from what I see many other conversation designers talking out there. It's great to deploy. It's great to answer most frequently questions, but there are other elegant implementations of that. I don't know if anyone or have a different take or different experiment on that, but I'm curious to hear whatever you have to say.
I think it's hard to have a different perspective on this, and from our experience, the key element is context. So when you're actually analyzing what are the key deliverables for your conversational experience, is where you start identifying places and areas where it would be either impossible or close to impossible or very hard to produce results with plain NLU. And that's usually the areas that are ripe for LLM usage, right? But again, depending on the context, depending on your ability to provide guardrails, for example, in order to make sure that the conversation is going to be safe to the user, is going to actually fulfill your the points that you want to achieve throughout the experience, and bring the user actual value, right? This I think Sean started with that, and it's utterly important to make sure that the value is what the user gets at the very end.
I was going to say here that it's honestly that's so refreshing to hear, right? Because that's actually something that conversation designers and those of us working in the field, we know that's like a core piece of our work. So just because we're using a different technology that's kind of coming into the play, doesn't mean we have to change some of our core, well, at least one of our core tasks, right? Which is, what is the value, right? What's the context of the situation that we're defining for? What are we solving for, right? That problem solving element, rather than coming in with, I think some of us have experienced from stakeholders that make it generative, right approach. And it's like, okay, let's step back here and like break down what that means. And to Caio's point, I think, really expanding what we think about when we think about the conversation design. We can design in more ways than just FAQ. And I think that's a trend that we're really seeing with LLMs, is just introducing the different ways that we can design. So those were all really great answers. I am feverishly taking notes over here on this. So thank you.
We also have a question from Mark about latency. So a big concern of LLMs is the latency of the response. This affects the experience, especially in voice assistants. So what improvements are you seeing in this area?
I can take this question. So this is something that we've been tracking quite closely. It's actually quite hard to measure because the jitter or the variation between getting a response back from a LLM provider on average versus the extremes can be quite different. In the technical world, our SRE world, we call it P95s, P99s. So out of 100 requests that you send, how slow is the slowest, or the top 5 slowest responses? So what's interesting is that there's been huge variation sort of when these models initially come out. When GPT-4 came out, ChatGPT came out as APIs, you'd have these crazy spikes. At one point, we're using Azure OpenAI, and every 10th request would just time out. It would take forever and it wouldn't come back. So that was definitely a little bit of a scary experience when people are building and integrating with these APIs, and they're so unpredictable. More recently, it's gotten a lot better. There's typically 2 metrics that we measure. The first one is the time to first token. So imagine you're generating a response. How long does it take for the first token, like a hi, or let me help you with that, or anything else that you're prompting come back? And then the subsequent part is that if you're generating 100 tokens or 1,000, what's the time per token? So that initial time to first token has really come down. It's now, I think, around 30 milliseconds for ChatGPT models, which is great. But generally what we found is that for ChatGPT and similar size models, whether it's Mixtral or Llama, the latency isn't too bad unless you're generating an essay. I know Pete can probably talk about this, how he has large language models write long, verbose responses. In that case, the latency matters, but the current optimizations are quite amazing. And this was an initial concern that we had, but right now a lot of these bots feel very fluid. So.
And I've worked on some large language model Alexa skills where there's been like a larger tech stack where we've then been running that through things like a synthetic voice, and you can see a large lag there. And we've experimented with a lot of things, having kind of filler audio where you kind of find a happy length where you say, we're willing to wait 4 seconds, and you have 4 seconds audio that plays before the response. If you're trying to mimic a human, that might be just like a let me think about that, things like that. But obviously that means the user is always waiting 4 seconds, rather than if the response comes back straight away, they get it straight away. So I'm excited for things to get faster and not have to do that. But in the meantime, there's workarounds you can do.
On one hand, the latency is today's problem because those models and platforms are getting increasingly faster. I mean, this week's or last week's announcement with Grok, right, and the ability to generate 400 tokens per second and with very low times to first token, basically show that it's not necessarily going to be tomorrow's problem, but a lot of the times it's not just about that. It's about how much you need to overlay with LLMs, right? It's quite often it's not just a single call to LLM that you have to worry about. You have to worry about multiple calls to LLMs, and they stack up, and that adds up very quickly. So I think that this is definitely something that requires quite a lot of user experience attention when you're actually designing for that particular experience. And as Siân mentioned, there are ways to deal with that, especially with longer latencies. But you know, we proved that it was possible to squeeze it into like 7-second timeouts that Alexa has on the response generation, for example, even though we had to generate an audio response that was actually produced in real time. So it's certainly possible right now.
Great. And I think just to, well, first of all, I also wanted to welcome quickly Peter, who is exceptionally in the same room as Dennis and standing in the same spot, which is amazing. But I was seeing there's a question from Michael, who's saying for what aspects, and I think this is a nice circle back to what Nicolle was hinting at the beginning, and maybe we can expand a little, not just on what happens in the conversation design, but you can take it anywhere you want. As Caio was saying, there's really no limits in thinking about what aspects of a conversational experience would you use NLU methods and where would you use LLMs instead. Whoever wants to take it can go on it.
I can jump in. So I actually think about the NLU hybrid with LLM in a couple different directions, right? So there's the architecture of your conversational design or your assistant, right? So even in the NLU world, we had different providers who had different opinions, right? For example, you had parent intent and then you had a child intent. So you had these like nested architectures where you might first enter into a top level intent and then sort of figure out what the user is trying to say afterwards. You also had patterns like doing entity capture on the intent itself, something that we had with Alexa, for example, and continue to have. Or you might just do intent matching and then do entity extraction later on. So there's all these like architectural questions that different platforms have formed different opinions on. And as a sort of conversational AI builder, you need to understand those limitations. So from a NLU and LLM perspective, a lot of people right now are actually using LLMs as NLUs, both on the intent and entity side. On the intent side, there's been an open source project released, I think, a couple months ago called Semantic Router, and people are like, "Oh, this is this new thing," and it's like, well, it's just an intent classifier with a new name. But in that case, we get into some interesting conversations where LLMs make a lot of assumptions, and with most people using LLMs, they don't go through that process of curating data. So, for example, we were building a little project to compare LLMs versus NLUs, and let's say that you're at a restaurant, and at a restaurant you sell hot beverages, or you might have another intent like pricing or something. So when somebody says, "I want a hot chocolate," an LLM will almost automatically classify it as a hot beverage. But what if you don't sell a hot beverage, right? Or what if you mention the name of a competitor's type of product instead? Should you still recognize that as the right intent or as the correct entity, right? So it's really important after you build that initial prototype to understand those nuances and still take the time that you did for an NLU system to curate data, find false positives, false negatives, and figure out what the LLM should classify. Because if you have an LLM, let's say pizza ordering bot, it'll accept most toppings, right? Whether or not you sell Hawaiian because you have a strong opinion if that's a pizza you should be selling, right? The LLM will say, yeah, that's a type of pizza. And most people, when they're experimenting, don't go beyond that. So I think it's really important to sort of go through that data curation process. Now, tying it back to the question, when to use an LLM versus an NLU, this goes back to some of those architecture decisions, right? So most NLUs will provide a single intent that you match against. Some provide multiple. So it's the same question with an LLM, right? Do you want to capture everything that the user said, play it back to them, and then go down a certain path? Or do you still want to use it as a more traditional NLU where you say, when somebody says, "Oh, I want a hot beverage," and then can I check the price? And actually, can I check my rewards program, right? How are you going to resolve that chain of thinking from the user? It's really important. So LLMs give you some more flexibility in general, but that flexibility can be quite harmful if you don't spend the time to architect the system properly.
I would like to say, Giulia. So I'm gonna continue, okay? I would like to go in a different direction, which is regarding to design a conversation experience. Many people think that to design something is to create a solution, but in reality is to understand the problem that is going to lead you to the solution. So it's a mistake, in my opinion, to jump directly in the prototyping phase. We need to understand what is this about, what is the context. We need to refine some ideas, and then we're going to define the prototype. The reason that I'm saying this is that in this job, to understand the business objectives, to understand the context of the user, to understand the user needs, it's kind of common to the designers, for the designers to define not a user path in terms of the flow, but the user path in terms to having this problem or how this person is going to solve this problem. On that journey, to do that, we can design the NLU map or 3 and understand what would be the questions that would be asked in some of these touch points that the user might have with a brand. And that in particular might sound different from an LLM, but in reality, that can add to the LLM models because we can help the LLM models to be more precise on the type of objections, the questions, whatever they might have. So to design a conversation experience, we need to understand the context. We need to understand the problem, and that translates to the solution. It's going to be a final product or a prototype. But when we do, what I'm trying to say is basically your job to understand the NLU map might be the same to trying to define a better LLM model. You can use both artifacts. One is going to empower other, and it does not exclude, I would say. The reason that I'm saying that is because some people think that LLM is going to be the silver bullet that is going to do everything. But in reality, designers, we're going to still need to do research. We're going to still need to have conversations with the users. We're going to still have to design things by hand, trying to figure out what be the best context. And that is going to translate to either the NLU or LLMs. It's going to be, as Danny said, it's going to be more like an architect decision. So my take on that would be, you can use both, but the job to trying to find the answer might be relevant to both of them. And do not ignore the other artifacts that as a designer needs to do, right? To understand the context and then design the solutions. That should not be ignored. If you're ignoring this, that can be a problem. And that can lead to hallucinations and other bad things. So that's my take on that. I think Peter would like to add.
Yeah, look, I think like when you're thinking about doing a kind of hybrid sort of model, you should really be thinking about what each one does best. So NLU is really great at matching utterances to a single intent. But, and while LLMs are good at kind of creating that sort of disambiguation, they're not that great at matching to intents because there is a huge amount of, there's this kind of dip in accuracy when you start having really large context windows and that sort of thing. So if you start using them together, a great way to think about this would be to surface a certain amount of intents to an LLM with descriptions of those intents so that an LLM can then start to do the reasoning between which one is this. So then you're not worried as much about having a fully fledged NLU model, which has, 100 utterances per intent to help the NLU with like the semantic understanding of what someone's saying. So thinking about it kind of like that, and I guess like one thing which I'd also like to touch on, is quite often people refer to NLU as just like the old way of designing things. So if you're thinking about just like the old way of designing things, I think probably what starts to happen more in the future is it's less about designing deterministic flows and more like about designing frameworks which your agents or whatever work within. So maybe you have a framework for a refund, maybe you have a framework for tracking an order, and then you kind of create like these like global frameworks which kind of route everything depending on the conversational context and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that over the past few months, I've worked on around about 4 different hybrid solutions, and all of them have had a completely different approach, dependent on what the product is. So it's really about understanding your product, understanding your goals. As a general rule, I try to avoid large language models for anything that's instructional or legal, things that I would consider over the line. So anything that might fall into hate speech or just anything horrid. And then also sensitive subjects, which could be things like talking about competitors or things even obviously like mental health and things like that. So they're for me the main consistent things, and then everything else is just so heavily dependent on what the product actually is and what the goals are.
I think that just builds on something that I've certainly noticed being a year on these Gen AI products, is that it all depends on the use case, right? Everything goes back to what is the use case, and then understanding that use case. And kind of what I'm hearing here too is, you know, the idea as the designer here who's sitting kind of over across all of it, right? It's being able to say, okay, this is the full experience, to be able to define that, get into some of the details, not necessarily prescriptive, but what's the shape of this? What's this assistant supposed to do? What is it not supposed to do? And then really looking at your tools, right? I have NLU, I have LLMs. What are the pros and cons of each, right? And I think that's something that as designers in this space, if you're just coming in as LLM and you haven't learned NLU, then maybe familiarize yourself with NLU, right? And the same for designers who've only been working on NLU, being able to kind of look at, you know, what LLMs do well and what they don't. I love the piece there that you had said, Siân, about what you want to use it for. For those of us that might work in, you know, sensitive situations like in finance, banking, healthcare. I know there's a lot of promises online about LLMs can do everything in these space, but in reality, companies have risk, right? And it's going to depend. So I love that topic. I'm going to keep on this kind of technical side, because something I think it was Dennis had brought up before. One of the things that everyone loved about when ChatGPT came out was that ability to have that conversation. It wasn't constrained, right? We could just go and jump subjects and move. And from a design perspective, I was so blown away by that. And so I'm wondering, when we start to combine that NLU hybrid experience, how do we keep that flow? How do we have context, contextual memory, and an LLM NLU hybrid? Because we want our users to have a back and forth. I see a lot of assistants right now that have just come out where it's like one answer, right? One conversational turn. And so how do we build in that contextual memory in an NLU LLM solution, hybrid solution? And does that change if you add a knowledge base to the mix? So a lot in that.
Yeah, I think I can start off. So I think to an earlier point, that context has been possible for many years, right? When somebody goes to a chatbot and somebody's logged into a system, a good chatbot can be like, hey, Dennis, like, welcome back, or hey, you haven't been here before, right? So these kinds of integrations have been possible for, call it 20 plus years, right? You have a variable, you substitute it in. Now, what gets interesting is that picking up context along with the conversation and actually mapping it out. So this sort of gets into that smarter entity fulfillment context. So if you're having a conversation and throughout you can identify that the user, let's say, again, going back to the pizza example, they're ordering a pizza, they're vegetarian, also have a gluten allergy, and they prefer to order medium pizzas on Fridays because they have a few friends over. So that information can be identified by keeping track of the previous turns in the conversation. Now, the question is, how do you map that to something actionable? So you could either do it with explicit entities, or you can try to summarize it with an LLM. So I think that that contextual response has become a lot easier because at certain points, you can use another prompt to say, hey, extract this information. Is there any information about the user's preferences for scheduling or past orders or dietary restrictions, right? And that becomes a lot easier along the way with these systems. Again, it goes back to the ease of use of prototyping and then figuring out more complex systems later. I think it's also possible to save some of this information into something like a knowledge base as a store for that, right? So there's many type of documents and databases available that we can use for these kinds of systems. It becomes interesting where you can interweave information that's more static within a knowledge base and something that's dynamic per user. And then you can retrieve that information out and inject it into the context. Sort of a tangible example, we have this bot on Discord that responds to user questions. It's called Tico. It's also deployed on our email integration for support. And one of the cool features is that depending on past user questions, we use that along with the question itself to figure out, is this a technical question or not? So the user can be shown information that's more relevant to them. For example, if we think it's a technical user with a technical question, they might get a response from a technical knowledge base that has API documentation, more advanced answers, as opposed to somebody who's asking a simple question, they might get a simpler response. So as an example, somebody asks, like, what is an intent? If you're asking as a beginner versus as an advanced user versus somebody who's asking for a specific use case or optimization for intents, you want to make sure that you're capturing and communicating the relevant information. So I think LLMs make it much easier to deploy these kinds of systems, but with enough engineering time and design, you could do it before.
I think it's also worth remembering that when you're dealing with LLMs, you have to think about the type of the context that you're dealing with. It could be, short-term memory, which is just the history of the current conversation. But it also could be long-term memory, where you choose to store certain information for a longer period of time. When the user returns back, you then build the context based on previous data. I mean, this is not something that is just something that we're solving right now. I mean, context management is something that has existed for a long time. It's just right now, as Dennis mentioned, with LLMs can actually help us build that context easier. Even if the whole conversation is driven by an NLU, you can use that for entity extraction or for context extraction, and that's where it plays an important role.
Yeah, and to add to that, with kind of people becoming more aware of contextual memory, what I'm seeing a lot of is people going, let's use it. Let's communicate back to the user that we kind of know their history. And sometimes it comes across back to the user as really condescending. So you're taking everything the user says, and then the bot is just wording it back to them in kind of fancier words. And actually, it can be really off-putting for the persona. So contextual memory is great, but again, it comes back to using it where it adds value rather than just adding it in because you can, because that can be really damaging to your tone of voice.
So it is interesting that we talk a lot about the engineering part of it, but maybe it's my context or the ecosystem that I'm based on. But just to give you a number, about 98% of the population in Brazil that has a smartphone has WhatsApp. WhatsApp here is king, is leading the way, and most people prefer to use WhatsApp just to send a message rather to have a call someone or call a business. The reason that I'm saying that is because context is key for the LLMs, but also we need to keep in mind that we need to maybe sometimes have a human on the loop. And we need to be able to translate that data, contextual data, to the human agent. So yes, there is the contextual data for the LLMs, but also we need to be in mind that we're designing a solution that is kind of used by in different ways for the human agent and also for the final user. So there is a name for that. It's CDP, Customer Data Platform. We need to be able to integrate these solutions and be able to be back and forth to add intelligence to the human agent, so this human agent can provide a better support to the final user. So yes, it's great to have contextual data for the LLMs, but we need to be in mind that this is a dance. We're dancing, the automation is dancing, and also the human support agent is dancing. And we need to be able to automate this dance and also to pass the data along with everybody. So we need to be mindful that there is solutions for that. Sometimes it's maybe one or two platforms that does this type of job. And then designer needs to understand that you can leverage these data either for the LLMs, but also you can pass the ball to the human agents to provide a better customer service. So keep in mind of that contextual data for the LLMs is great, but don't forget the human agent. Help this person to do a better job. In the end, that is going to add value to the human experience, the final user experience. And that's what many companies do down here in Brazil. We go to WhatsApp or channels like this, messaging channels. It's because it's more scalable. We have more time to answer. It's a different ecosystem, I would say. I don't know what you all think about that, but it's just a different take on data, just to go to a different direction.
I love a new direction. I'll give you that. Also, it shows kind of the holistic thinking about kind of certain use cases, right? It doesn't just end at the chatbot. We have other options as well. I have a next question, but there was a question in there from Mark that was, is there a place that identifies design patterns for NLU and LLM hybrid systems? I don't know about you all. I haven't actually seen that. But one thing that did come out was Google has people in AI research. They do a lot of work on kind of like human-centered AI design. And they have a recent post on interaction design policies designed for the opportunity, not just the task. And I read this and it really mirrored so much of what we do in conversational AI. A lot of what we've said as designers in this conversation about the use case, defining the parameters, right? So instead of designing a prescriptive flow, we go more high level and say, okay, what is it that we want assistant to solve? What's acceptable? What's unacceptable? What are the vulnerabilities here? And I'm not logged in, so I can't post it, but I'll share it so that way the moderators can share this. But I'd recommend taking a look at that because I thought it was a really incredible resource for understanding kind of whether you're in NLU or LLM. It's really, what are the expectations of the model that we're working with? And how do you define those for your design and also for the stakeholders? Anyone have ideas on design systems for LLMs and NLU?
Yeah, so it's actually something that I'm thinking about a lot lately, and I've started to break that. As I kind of touched on before, like I think the future of conversation design is really all about creating frameworks for an agent to work within. And so far, this is very much a kind of, I'm thinking about this. So it's
Peter, I think you cut it out. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I guess as I touched on before, I'm thinking about kind of frameworks which designers can work within, as I think that's kind of how the future of conversation design will be. It's not going to be about, designing things turn by turn. It's about designing frameworks for your agent. And at the moment, I've kind of defined 5 that I can see. And they are, so you would have a global framework. So that is kind of, the overarching behaviors of a conversational agent. So maybe you're thinking about things like user routing, error handling, global context management and session management, and all those sorts of things. Then you would have like a local framework, which is more the state-specific parts of a conversation. So as I mentioned before, you could have a refund, a track my order, all those sorts of things. You would then have an interaction framework, which is really like the tone and style that your agent delivers. You know, at the moment, that could just be as simple as having very shared system prompts that, you know, all of the prompts that you are using to generate content use. A kind of data handling and analytics framework. So how do we handle data and display that to an LLM? And similarly, like, how do we use our conversations to like, and potentially LLMs as well, to pull out information so that we can make better decisions going forward? And then finally, an integrations framework. So, you know, how does the conversational agent interface with other systems, and how do we build these bridges so that the agent can dynamically call on these systems depending on the situation that they're in? So that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about it. And I'm like literally doing work on it at the moment, trying to think about what this looks like. And that's how, yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it at the moment. Like, obviously, there isn't really any system at the moment which allows you to do all of these things. But yeah, that's where I think we'll end up. Or I could be completely wrong.
Just quickly, one thing that I would like to add is that right now we're in such an exploratory phase with LLMs that, you know, it feels like it's almost impossible to generate something that will last for a long time in terms of specific guidelines to build stuff, because, you know, every other day we're getting a new paper that uncovers something that the LLMs can do that nobody even thought that they could do, right? So right now, certainly from my perspective, is all about looking at a specific use case and then applying common sense practices from both a conversational design but also software development on top of that, and then combining it all together. That's what's producing the best results so far.
I think as well, I think a lot of the current conversation design best practices of how you manage a conversational state at any one time still apply. It's just you build them in completely different ways. And that, I think that's the kind of idea with a framework, is that like you give like a openness to how things could happen. Like, you don't have a deterministic flow that goes, this is the way that we're going to do this because we believe this is the best way for the user to do this. But rather, you know, maybe you're booking a trip to go to Tokyo. The bot says, would you like to go? You respond, what's the weather like in August? And then the bot responds, the weather's like this. Like, would you like to book for August, or would you prefer something cooler or something like that? Like in that.
I think we froze again. Oh, there we go.
Can I say something?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Peter, I might have two suggestions for you. One is a book. It's called The Elements of User Experiences. That book, Jesse James Garrett, he lays out 5 layers of any experience. And I think you touch on all of those layers with the framework. Might be a benchmark for the work that you are doing right now. And the way that you kind of describe it right now, it feels like the second order of cybernetics. I don't know if you heard about that, but I would suggest you take a look on that. Cybernetics, Gordon Pask, and go to that direction. That goes kind of deep on system thinking and goes deep in interaction model. And there is a book about that. It's called Designing Systems, which might be what you're kind of talking about, but it's not about agents. It's more like human systems having conversations with systems, and etc. I would like to add a different way of thinking on this, Nicolle, which is, you know, we live in different cities globally. We are, I think, all the continents here, I would say. But there is one thing that is quite similar for everybody today. That is, whenever you're going to buy something, we have a particular journey. Everybody has a different journey, but we kind of have the same stages of that journey. Did you know that the user buyer journey was invented in 1929 and has more than 80 years and is still relevant today? What I'm trying to say is that if we try to understand these moments and these stages, we might think about specific frameworks for a specific stage, maybe try to offer specific solutions about that. I cannot go deep on this because it is what the company that I work for is doing. But that's kind of the way. Understand the journey. We have been knowing this journey in about 80 years is about five stages. Awareness, consideration, discovery. Now I forgot the words in English. But that's it. If you understand the moments that the user is on these particular stages, you can think about specific frameworks for each stage and how we can take one person from one stage to the next stage. Sometimes it's about brand awareness. That's one agent. Sometimes it's about human customer care. That's another agent. Sometimes it's just about the transaction. That's another agent. We can think about specific agents for specific moments in that journey and work with that framework that has been around for many years. And that's not technology. It's basically marketing. It's Philip Kotler. It's marketing 5.0. If we look on that for that perspective and try to deliver solutions to the market that is going to address that way of working that has been around for many years, that's a scalable way to try to think about solutions, either using NLU or LLMs. So it's a different thinking, I would say. Maybe it's different. It's a different way of seeing things.
I think it's, I think this is what I like, the different perspectives coming together, right? To kind of show how this gets built, because in the end, we're not taking one approach, right? It's clear that the use case is going to matter, your teams, your technology, like there's so many variables that go into building this, right? So I do appreciate that. And boy, do I love a book recommendation. So I wrote that down. We have a little bit of time left, not much. I want to get to a question that really is about processes and how things might change. Because one of the things that I've learned in the last year on Gen AI, and I'm hearing from you all, is that we're partnering a lot more as a designer with data scientists and engineers. And it's rocking my world in the best way because I'm learning a lot. I think, being able to partner with engineering and have them say, actually, if you build out the architecture like this, we can do some really cool things. And I'm curious from, anyone's perspective here, how might our conversational AI teams and processes change? What does collaboration look like kind of going forward in this NLU LLM space? And we have about 6 minutes, so it's kind of a lightning round question.
Okay, I don't mind jumping in there. I found that we're doing a lot more upfront with the strategy. My strategy, creative strategy documents have more than doubled in size. And we're definitely drawing in the tech teams at an earlier point to review what we're doing and making sure that it's possible, but then also kind of broadening our insights as well as reining us back. So a lot more collaboration and a lot more strategy up front, probably slightly less build, I would say, and then a lot more testing and refinement. So less in the middle, but more at the start and at the end is what I'm finding.
And from a technical team's perspective, I think that where we used to have this almost a fence, right, where you would get a VUX design, wouldn't be set in stone, but it would be a document that you build upon, right? Right now, that has shifted more heavily, as Sean said, into the strategy phase. And that VUX design becomes less relevant. I mean, it's still relevant, it's still there, but the strategy drives the experience more than the actual, flowcharts that we used to have, and that gets augmented at the testing phase as well, right? There are times where, from the testing phase, we need to go back almost to the strategy and make some decisions that influence the entire experience. So we're definitely I would say we're more joined. We're almost joined by the hip right now between the engineering teams and conversational designers.
I think that the change of technology has also enabled, if you call it, both sides to get a little bit more perspective. Like, it's easier now to build like a functional LLM or NLU model, right, as the technology has gotten better. And then from an engineering perspective, it's easier to see what's like a good user experience as you play around with more of these models that are conversational. Like in other parts of the engineering world, we have like the concepts of DevOps and ML ops. And we can talk about, I know to call it conversational AI ops, where it's a continuous refinement process through collaboration. It's not just a fence to throw it over. And I'm hoping LLMs are that unifying factor with everybody has a common point of excitement to build and refine and work together. So I'm excited for that direction in the industry.
And interestingly, it's probably a very design specific change, but I'm actually finding that I'm probably writing more copy among mapping out tone of voice in a lot more detail than previously I would have done, but also things like training copy. I kind of thought that large language models would take that away from me, but if anything, it's grown the area of understanding tone of voice and linguistics and writing copy.
Perfect. That would be my take. If the conversation is the median, the content of that conversation is what is relevant. The context, the language, tone of voice. So it is a designer's job to help to design that, or either write. Might not be you, might be someone else, but that's a teamwork. It's a dance. Remember, you're going to collaborate with many other people. So that's my take.
Awesome. So I think Nicolle will probably be back on in a second, but here we go. Awesome. But there were a couple, I don't know if anyone has to drop, but there are a couple other questions that I really want to get to as well. Definitely from Shelby and Melanie and a couple others. Let me touch on Shelby's first, and then we'll get to Melanie's, and then there are two others I think that I see. So Shelby's question is, what have y'all noticed regarding user expectations about how they should interact with conversational AI experiences now that LLMs are more mainstream? And how does that inform your design approaches? For instance, I'm noticing a bit of increase in multi-intent utterances, long rambles, etc., things that classic NLU often has trouble with, but LLMs are expected to handle seamlessly. So does anyone have anything else?
I found that kind of maybe 12, 18 months ago, before large language models became a big thing, you could push the boundaries with how you worded your kind of prompts. You could structure them slightly more open-ended because users were getting used to the way that Alexa worked. Whereas then large language models came in and all of a sudden their expectations changed. And now you can't really do that. If you leave it too open-ended, the user will just go off on one. So I think you have to go back to the more stricter way when you're within NLU. And then when you're within the large language model, you can broaden that and create it really broad. But there has to be a huge contrast between the two areas. If you go anywhere in the middle, it can just create a mess.
But that's precisely where the role of a conversational designer comes in, and is so important right now for those experiences, is to make sure that we don't create those open-ended experiences. Because for the most part, when you're trying to solve a problem, you don't need that. You don't need to talk about everything, and that's why I think the role generally of a conversation designer is super important here, to make sure that we guide that user through that experience and take them on a journey where they feel like everything is open, but we're talking within a given context, right? And we're handling everything else gracefully, but not necessarily allowing that user to go on a tangent, or not setting false expectations that experience, whether it's a voice experience or a textual experience, chatbot will provide them everything.
Yeah, I think to add to that, when ChatGPT came out, the messaging and what we've seen a lot with LLMs is that this is magic. It can do anything, it can do everything. Even the demos that were showcasing this had mistakes, right? And I think in 2024, we're getting to the point where people and business leaders realize, okay, LLMs aren't magic. How do I design the system to accomplish my business goal? It's not just going to be ChatGPT on my website, right? That's not what we're going to build, even though that was the expectation kind of in 2023. So I'm happy that we're starting to have that realization that things need to be designed, as everybody has said. But users still often expect magic, especially as this technology continues to democratize and you get into the longer and longer tail, right? You give a demo, for example, grandparents, right, about this AI stuff. They're like, whoa, can I ask it anything? Will it do everything, right? And the answer is no, but you have to walk that expectation line as these models are presenting that they can do everything, but we're starting to realize the limits and have to start designing within them.
I did a customer research study where I was asking people. I was trying to understand trust with regards to finances, right? People understanding their finances through a chatbot. That was kind of the overarching goal. But in that, I also asked them, how are you using ChatGPT right now? And it was really interesting to hear the responses, because even if you ask anyone in your life, how are you using ChatGPT, you're going to get a range of responses, and that's exactly what happened. And my immediate thought was, are they going to want to do that in my bot? Right. And then how do you build a bot that provides value beyond that? Right. That was something that kind of came up, and it's still, I don't know that it's necessarily always, I have an answer for that. Right. But it has been interesting to both, listen to customers talk about, I need this from a bot, respond to, some of the solutions in testing, and say, I need to go deeper. Right? Like, you're giving me information here, but I just need to go deeper. And it's interesting because it's like, I think that would still exist in NLU, but I also think that so many people are much more comfortable using a chatbot now than they were, a year and a half ago. And I wonder what that does for expectations. And I'd really like to see if anyone has seen studies on this, like actual research, like, has that mental map shifted? Because I'm willing to bet yes. I see in transcripts we have, we've always had long queries and utterances and stuff like that, but I haven't really done a study on like comparing before ChatGPT came out. So if anyone has done that or is going to do that, I'd love to hear it, because just anecdotally, it seems like that's happening as people are putting more information. We're also running into, how do you educate the customer about the boundaries of your bot, which is something we already did beforehand, but now we have that expectation. So what does it look like to educate them? Is it, I'm talking only in the bot context, chatbot context, but buttons or just how you greet them, right? That welcome menu might need to do an extra bit of work now, right?
I think
teach customers.
That's so much more important now more than ever too, because it's like people just expect the LLMs to be able to handle that. But like, we also have to teach the user how to use it too. It's not like that goes away. So I think we still need to account for that within the design, within the conversation, for sure.
I actually love that the user expectations are inflated, because they're pushing us to remove the sorry, I don't know that out of the design of any conversational experience. And that's actually a good thing, because that element of education can be a part of the conversation itself, and actually should be, because when the user tries to ask our car mechanic chatbot to give them a recipe how to bake a cake, it shouldn't really, respond with, sorry, I don't know that, but with a thoughtful response that, puts them back on track for that particular conversation to achieve that particular goal. And that's what I love with the inflated expectations that the user have after, playing with ChatGPT.
So
There is
go ahead.
two things I share with you in the chat. There is a company that kind of touches on this question that Nicolle shared. It's CX Trends by Zendesk. They just announced it last week here in Brazil. The Latin research. I didn't have the time to take a look on that, but last year they kind of asked people about, do you like to talk to bots or not? They had some questions about that. I'm sure they're going to talk about Gen AI this year, but I didn't have the time to take a look, so I'm not sure. And also to Michal talk's point, in design, we do have a word for that. It's called anticipation. There is a design way of seeing that. Is anticipatory design. Is a perspective of trying to understand the journey and trying to anticipate the needs of the user. So that even with high expectations, they're going to be designed because we're going to deliver the need that they have. One really easy example of that, it's Netflix. You're going to open it and trying to find a movie. They're going to recommend you suggestions that is relevant to you. That's one simple thing, simple example. We can try to do that, but it's really hard because sometimes you just don't have the data to anticipate. But we can try to build machines and systems to try to do that. I think that Tico example that Dennis or was Peter mentioned that kind of touches on that. But that's, if anyone is interested about how to do that, just look for anticipatory design. You're going to see a bunch of articles about that, which is really interesting.
So in the interest of time, I'm just going to switch to one other question, and then we'll get to Melanie's questions, and then we'll just end with those. So this question is, has anyone looked into the calm approach from Raza in using LLMs for dialogue management and not for prompt generation? I don't know if anyone has here.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit into it. I think it's a really interesting framework to go ahead in. The nice thing about it is it keeps the structure of sort of dialogue management NLUs with sort of their YAML format. I think it's pretty powerful. It kind of goes back to that question of how do you use the LLM versus NLU? In this case, it's kind of like a semantic router, intent classification, but being able to resolve multiple sequences of events. So I think we're going to move more into that. I think the question becomes, how do you provide that framework for deciding, do you keep asking the user a question? Do you go down that path? When do you go back to a previous question that the user asked? How do you deal with interruptions? So I think it's a great step in that direction. I think the question is, how well will LLMs advance to be able to fully adapt to this kind of framework? I think the answer is they'll keep getting better. They'll keep getting more natural. But then it becomes a question on sort of how do you manage expectations? How do you test all these other things that we wonder about in the conversational AI space? So cool framework. If you haven't checked it out, would definitely recommend it. They have some good notes in their documentation.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts? Or okay. So I will go to Melanie's question. We have two questions. So what role does ethics play into the design process when using an NLU versus LLM? And then the last question is, who is responsible for guiding the conversation designers in ethical design principles? So I guess let's start with the first one.
Absolutely huge role. It's one of the kind of main focuses of the strategy, would be kind of guardrailing, identifying the risks, the level of the risks. So tend to be going on a structure, something along the lines of irrelevant, but not harmful, sensitive to the brand, kind of what we call walking the line, where it might be a little bit of like gentle banter and maybe a little bit of innuendo, but nothing hugely harmful, and then over the line where you're really not comfortable with what's being said and you don't want to handle that. So kind of looking at each of those areas and then the best way to handle them. Obviously, anything that's over the line, you want to be looking at passing that down the NLU route. Whereas things that are maybe irrelevant but not harmful, you might pass that off to the LLM and allow them to generate a personalized response that gets the user back on track. Something that is maybe like a sensitive subject, you still might hand that on to the LLM, but with a different prompt that gives a little bit of extra context for the response. So don't repeat back that brand, or like, this is your point of view on this subject, things like that. So it's a really big part of the strategy. And from a first point of view, I'd say that would fall on a designer. But then further down the line, when it comes into testing, I quite often will have the tech team come back to me and say, this guardrail is being triggered, like, it's too sensitive. What can we do? Do we want to adjust our approach to be more appropriate? So that's my take on that.
I can recommend a book. It's called Ruined by Design. It's a great book. Take a look. You're going to learn a lot about that. How designs can influence the world and the decisions that we make. It's kind of political decisions. Everything is a political act. The way that we see, or the way that we speak, the way that we dress up, everything that we do is kind of political act. And to design something is to make a political act, to design something that is going to impact life. So many things comes to form that design, and we should be aware of that. So that's my take on that. There is a really cool book, lay out what is wrong and what we can do to save that. It's not only about AI, it's really broad, but it's basically the same foundation, I would say.
Yeah, I think jumping into the data and disclosure side, I think that's still really important. So when are you collecting user data? How are you using that data? And then making sure that people know that they're talking to bots. I mean, if you have a standard bot interface where it's like little thing that pops up in the bottom of your website, that's pretty obvious, or it's a standard design pattern, but probably should still say, hey, this is a bot. But when you get into more complex interfaces, for example, when we have AI generated responses for email support questions, we always start off, hey, this is a bot. Like, we're doing this to help expedite your response, but know that this is not a human. We're not trying to masquerade as a human. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people sort of newer to the space who've been jumping on into the like chat with AI, build AI bots. Their goal is to try to almost deceive users into saying, look, we've proven the Turing test. Like, you can't tell if this is a human or a bot. There are a couple stories with mental health companies or healthcare companies trying to do this. And being like, look, people have better outcomes. And it's like, well, you should probably disclose to people that they're chatting with a bot, especially in that case of sensitive or personal information. That's important to that journey. So I think we have to continue doing that, even though it sort of breaks that facade that AI is equivalent to human experiences.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I do. I have a thought, just from the perspective of the designer. Those of you that have been in the space, you'll often find yourself in design facilitation discussions, right? And if you're not, well, you got to kind of claw your way in a lot of the time, right? And so being able to go in there and raise the questions, the hard questions, and say, is this ethical? Is this right? And my favorite question is, what is the impact on our users? What customers, people, users really abstracts it, but what's the impact here on people? And really getting clear on what is the expected impact. And are we aligned on that? Because sometimes when you're working cross-functionally, you'll find that people have different expectations, right? And so we talk about ethics and doing the right thing and all this kind of stuff, but on a practical, from a practical point of view, it's often you as the designer asking the hard questions or saying, this isn't right. Sometimes it's in the form of data. Why are we using this data? I mean, I've certainly been, not necessarily here, but on other projects where it's like, I've seen data where we're using gender or race, and it's like, why are we using this data? Right? how does this help the model? How does it hurt? Right. And so being, if you're not comfortable having those conversations, working on what do you need to know to be comfortable to have those conversations, right? So being able to find your voice and speak up, I think is really important, because there are assumptions made at every point of the development process. And being able, as a designer, you're really good at questioning assumptions, right? That's kind of your job. And so getting comfortable with that, I think, is really part of, ethics. We talk a lot about bias and ethics, but really being specific about what does that actually mean to have bias? Where does bias show up, right?
And also transparency to users too, like telling them what information you're taking, giving them options to let them know what's happening. If there's a bad outcome, how can they, yeah, I think there's so many facets to ethics that go into a conversation. It should be thought about through every stage of the experience, starting from conception. Yeah. And I think just taking into consideration all of the human needs throughout the experience too. And I will plug the Open Voice Trust Work initiative. There's a course on the edX platform on ethical principles for conversational AI, and that will hopefully help people. We can drop the link in the chat. But that kind of gives you an overview of the kinds of things you need to take into consideration, what types of information that can be taken from your voice or from conversational interactions, with a focus on voice too. But yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. Awesome.
I'm going to say one thing.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
As a designer, I forgot this before. Who's in the room, right? Who's in the room for these conversations about ethics and bias, right? Do you have the right people in the room to have this conversation? Because if it's just you and your boss, I'm going to tell you it's probably not. If it's just you and an engineer, it's probably not the right people to have in the room. So that's one more I forgot to say.
And I think everyone also needs to be educated about, like, no matter how involved you are in the experience, everyone needs to have the same level of education about what the AI technology is doing, how it works, being transparent about like how decisions are being made within the systems and also outside of the systems, human decisions as well. So kind of having that knowledge about the entire process, even if you just have a small role, I think is very important. So yeah, awesome. Well, I mean, we definitely have so much more to cover. There's so many other topics that we can go off of this, but that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for joining, everyone, and stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have some more panel discussions around these topics coming up. So yeah, have a great night or day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.